Hello! For this video class, we're going to be talking about learner diversity, and more specifically on the subtopic of gender. You may have noticed that Chapter 4 in your book also covers multicultural differences in your students. You may wonder why we haven't covered that in this course. The reason being, one of the co-requisites for this course is EDTE 2020, which focuses on multicultural diversity, so we felt it would be redundant to also cover it in this course. Alright, so let's jump into gender. And I thought I'd just simply start with a question of how many of you have taken a course on gender? If this is something that you have an interest in or you've already taken coursework in, you might start to feel this way. But please do know we all have various experience levels when it comes to our knowledge about gender studies. There are a lot of different ways that we can study it and look at it. And this is just one small portion of one chapter in this book. So we're not going to be able to delve quite too deeply in this subject, regardless of how interesting it is. So here's what we are going to look at. Some terminology, look at some research on known gender differences, look at some theories out there regarding the origins of gender differences, talk a little bit about gender spectrum as well as teaching tips. So let's start with a little demonstration. I want you to picture in your mind each of these individuals that I'm about to tell you, okay, their job title. A fashion model. What do they look like? Picture it in your mind. A bank president. What do they look like? An elementary school teacher. And a building contractor. So think about who you pictured for each of these occupations. Which individuals did you picture as male? Which did you picture as female? Within our society, within our culture, we have a lot of preconceived notions about the types of jobs each gender is more typical to hold. So just a beginning demonstration to show you some of our preconceived notions. Here are some key terms. First of all, I think we need to distinguish between sex and gender. So sex is your biological status. Okay, so what you are born with. Are you born XX? Are you born XY? What is your biological category, shall we say? Now, we do know that there are some instances where that is not entirely clear. Then gender is different than that. Gender is the labels, the traits, the connotations that society attributes to your sex. So what does it mean to be male or female? What is masculinity? What is femininity? Those things are cultural. Those things can change over time. Those things can change based upon the region of the globe that you're living in. So I think that this is a good way of thinking about it. So sex refers to the body. Gender refers to the mind. So, another demonstration. What are some words or adjectives that we in general tend to use to describe femininity or masculinity? Think about it. What are some of the adjectives that you use for both of those? The traditional gender stereotypes, these are words or adjectives that we usually attribute to femininity. That they're not aggressive, they're more dependent, they're more easily influenced and submissive. You can read down that list. More emotional, more kind, more nurturing. For masculinity, more aggressive, more independent, not easily influenced, and all the way down to more logical, analytical, cruel, and blunt. And again, that is a societal label that we tend to attribute to these different genders. So gender. Then there's gender identity. Gender identity is an individual person's psychological sense of whether they are male or female. Okay, so again, gender is all the labels and adjectives that society attributes to male and female. Gender identity is an individual's, I hate to replicate the word identification, but how they view themselves as male or female. Then gender expression is a person's outward expression of their gender. Now, those two things may or may not be the same. So gender identity is internal, in the mind, how you view yourself, your own psychological sense of who you are, male or female. Gender expression is more about the clothes that you wear, the way you do your hair, any makeup you might use on your face, etc., to imply to others what your gender is. And then we have androgyny. Androgyny is a person that combines both masculine and feminine traits. Now, you may or may not have seen this. There are a lot of different versions of it. We're going to look at two today. The first one being the genderbread person. And let me get my laser pointer out to help us along. Okay, let's look at our genderbread person. We're going to start with gender identity. And you can see here gender identity is attributed to the mind, right here, identity, and that is in your own head, how you view or think about your own gender. Okay? That is separate from gender expression. And we can see here gender expression is the way you present yourself to others to demonstrate your gender. Okay, how you want to appear to others. Then you have your biological sex, which we have down here on our genderbread person to indicate biologically whether you are male or female. And I do want to point out one more thing on our gingerbread person is orientation. That orientation is more about how you feel. All right, we will be coming back to that. We're going to be looking at it a little bit differently in a little bit. But first, let's take a look at gender development. Let's take a look at some research differences on males and females. So gender development, let's go back to very young children. We're going to start around the age of 2 to 3. This is when children start to be able to label or identify themselves as male or female, and they also start to label and identify others as male or female. During this time period, their concept of sex is really based on outward characteristics. Now, you might wonder, why do I have the My Little Pony characters up here? So when my daughter was this age, she was obsessed with My Little Pony. And I noticed that she started really trying to label other cartoon characters as male or female. And I asked her one day, so how do you make that distinction? How do you know if the pony or the rabbit or the cat is male or female? And her answer was, and very simply she put it, she said, well, the females have long eyelashes and the males do not. Now, in real life, that is not true. In fact, most males that I know have beautiful long lashes, but I did notice in the cartoon world, that is almost a universal. The males do not have eyelashes and the females do. But regardless, so children tend to look at outward clothing. They look at what color you're wearing, they look at how long your hair is, and whether or not you wear jewelry. Or, in my daughter's case, eyelashes to determine gender. Around the ages of 4 to 6, what you find is they get very rigid ideas about gender stereotypes. That girls should play with dolls, that boys should play with cars. They tend to, this is like the most rigid time in your life in terms of your ideas of males and females. And they also get very confused when they see things to the contrary. When they see a boy with very long hair, a girl with very short hair, or dressed differently, it confuses them because they tend to think in these very stereotypical manners. Here's a short video. It's pretty cute. It's just interviewing kids, hearing what they have to think and say about gender.
Children have a strong sense of gender identity and gender role expectations. Most 2-year-olds know with certainty whether they are male or female, and by the age of 4 or 5 begin not only to develop gender constancy, but often show rigid standards for what they believe is appropriate male and female dress and behavior.
Can boys put on dresses? Do girls have short hair or long hair?
Long hair.
Are you a boy or a girl?
A boy.
Are you ever going to be a girl?
No.
What are boys like?
Oh, I don't know.
Are they different than girls? How are they different than girls?
Because they don't put stuff like girls on.
Boys don't put on girls' clothes?
No.
Can girls put on boys' clothes?
No.
Alexis, are you a boy or a girl?
A girl.
Are you ever going to be a boy?
Mm-mm.
Are you a boy or a girl?
Boy.
Are you ever going to be a girl?
No. Boys are better than girls.
Why?
Because boys are stronger than the girls sometimes.
What would happen if you put on a dress?
All the girls and all the boys will laugh at me.
So I think there you can see, again, the rigid stereotypes that young children have, and also some of the things you might want to think about when talking with your kids, talking with your students about being accepting of other kids. All right, so where do these gender differences come from? Now, we're also going to be talking about theories of where these come from, as well as where these kids might get some of these ideas. But actual gender differences is what we want to take a look at now. So we're going to start developmentally, look at some gender differences across age groups and different categories. So in infants. Typically in infants, you really don't see much in the way of gender differences. The only thing you tend to see is that males are more active. They are more likely to move their body about, kick their legs. They do tend to fuss and cry a bit more. They are just simply more active babies than female infants are. And then around the time they start to turn to about 2 years old is when we first start to see more in the way of actual differences in gender in terms of their behaviors. So before I go over them, I just thought I'd start by asking you, what do you think some of those differences are? So starting around the age of 2, if you're comparing boys and girls, what are some differences you might observe? Well, it's a good question to ponder. Let's take a look. What does research say? So we're going to start here, and let me get my laser pointer back. We're going to start here by focusing on play. What differences do we see in terms of how they play? Boys and girls, during this time period when they're young, typically play with their own sex. Girls play with girls, boys play with boys. After the age of 3, we start to see this steady difference in how they want to play and what they want to play with. And what we tend to see, starting from age 3 and on, girls want to play with things that are soft and cuddly. They tend to engage in what we call cooperative play. Cooperative play means that they are working together to meet the same goal in whatever their play might be, that perhaps they're both working on feeding and taking care of their baby dolls. Or they're both playing with stuffed animals and creating a vet to take care of the cats. Okay? So they're working together, and they often play in pairs. Now let's compare that to what we tend to observe in boys after age of 3. Rather than soft dolls and toys, they tend to play with blocks, cars, trucks, things that are harder and obviously different in terms of tactile. And the way they play is different. Their play is much more competitive. So their play is about winning. So the goal isn't for them both to be working together to achieve the same goal. One of them wants to beat the other one. One of them wants to win. And their play is much more active, whereas girls' play is a bit more sedentary. And they tend to play in larger groups than pairs if they're given the option. Here's a short video looking at some of these differences in play.
As young peers interact, gender typing, the process of acquiring society's gender-linked preferences and behaviors is clearly evident. Gender-stereotyped play, apparent at age 2, increases over the preschool years and is especially strong for boys. Although individual differences exist, in general, boys tend to play more actively than do girls, a style that can lead to more aggressive interchanges with peers. Girls, in contrast, tend to prefer quieter activities, and by age 4, children spend far more time with same-sex than other-sex playmates, a preference that increases into the school years. Once children become conscious of gender role expectations, they begin to form a gender role identity, or view of themselves as relatively masculine or feminine in characteristic.
Okay, now I admit I'm not exactly sure what that activity was there at the end where the teacher is holding up the purse. But anyway, the rest of the information was pretty solid in terms of what we tend to find when we're looking at gender differences. And one thing I do want to point out before moving on, those gender differences in play, that is a universal finding. It is not just something we find in the United States. If you look across the globe, urban areas, rural areas, tribal areas, boys play more active, more competitive. It is just simply a difference that we tend to see, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. All right, so here, what about differences in their friendships? Girls, more likely to have a single best friend. Now, they do tend to have other friends as well, but they usually have one friend that they have a special connection with, that they really share with, and they spend time talking about their feelings, talking about secrets and thoughts that they have, and sharing their innermost private ideas. Boys tend to have larger groups, so they have more than one person that they're friends with. And when they do get together, they don't spend time talking to one another. They tend to spend their time playing some sort of game. Some sort of rule-governed game, usually where, again, there is some sort of a winner or a way to win. So again, a big difference in their friendships and what they do with their friends. So now let's look at differences in behavior. So let's start with girls. And this time we're going to go down one column at a time again. Okay, so girls, more likely to be anxious or fearful. And that is something that we do tend to find a good bit, that they do tend to be more nervous. And you tend to see this with academics as well. They're more worried about their grades, and they're more, that motivates them to study more because they're so conscious about and worried about their grades. Girls are more likely to be extroverted, so they're more sociable. Girls do tend to be more trusting of others and more trusting of authority figures. So they are better at taking orders. They're better in the classroom when they're being told what to do about following those instructions. And they're more interdependent, which means they tend to, their feelings are connected to the feelings of another person. They tend to get wrapped up in worrying about how other people feel, and that in some way guides and directs their behavior sometimes. Now, let me go backwards. I thought my arrows would come over here, but I'll use my laser pointer. Let's look at boys. Boys are more likely to be aggressive. And in fact, I'm going to put the words aggressive and assertive together. So aggressive is what you tend to see more in the playground with their play. They're more likely to engage in fights and conflict also in schools. Physical fights and conflict compared to girls. They are also more assertive. So, okay, so when I'm saying that boys are more assertive, what you might tend to see is they could have a harder time taking command statements or direct instructions from their instructor. So compare that over here where I said that females tend to be more trusting of others and especially authority figures, so they are more submissive in the classroom. This combination of aggression and assertiveness causes boys to have a bit of a harder time with following those types of directions and orders from authority figures. They tend to also have higher self-esteem or confidence. Now here's another interesting difference. Let's look up here. Girls have more anxiety and fear. Studies have found that this tends to push them to study harder because they worry about getting bad grades. Since boys have higher self-esteem, they tend to not study as much because they have more confidence in their abilities. And then down here, boys tend to be more independent. So over here, I said girls were interdependent. So that means they are concerned about how their actions affect other people, and they worry about other people's feelings in regards to their behaviors. Boys tend to act independent of that, so they typically aren't as concerned with their effect upon other people or other people's feelings. They might appear more domineering. All right, so here's some data to look at where I mentioned the aggressive differences, because I like to point out that these findings are not just stereotypical points of view. These are based upon large-scale research findings comparing boys and girls. That doesn't mean that every boy is described the way I just had or every girl, but these, again, large-scale findings. So, aggression in preschool children. Preschool means under the age of 6. So one of the first big things that I note when I look at this data is that boys overall are almost twice as likely to engage in aggressive behavior than girls are. The second thing that I notice is the most common type of aggression is boy to boy. So again, I think sometimes it's just helpful to see the data behind some of these findings. So here's another question for you. What gender differences might you observe in your students when it comes to academics? Because we've talked about play, we've talked about friendships, we've talked about general behavior. What about school? Let's take a look. So I'd like to start out by pointing out that research studies show that males and females tend to be similar in IQ. So IQ stands for intelligence quotient. It is a measure of your general intelligence, which includes things like your ability to problem solve, your potential for reasoning. IQ is a very interesting field, but regardless, males and females tend to be similar in general IQ. But let's move along where we have seen some differences, starting with girls are more likely to get good grades, but males tend to score higher on achievement tests and standardized tests. That is a very interesting finding. The speculation is that since females tend to have more anxiety about their grades, that pushes them to study more, which causes good grades, because we know grades involve a lot of things, not just tests. Boys tend to do better on tests because their higher level of confidence, which we know anxiety can be an impediment on tests. Here's some data showing some of those gender differences. So this is SAT scores over a period of about 30-40 years. And you can see that although there is a similar trend over time, there is consistently a big difference between males and females. All right, so what else do we see? In terms of subjects, it's a pretty well-known difference that females tend to do better in the language arts, in verbal skills, reading and writing. And in general, males tend to do better in science, math, and visual spatial skills. And again, this doesn't mean all females are one way and all males are another. It's just this is a general trend. This is why there's been a lot of work and grant money and research towards trying to engage females more into the math and sciences. Now, if you're not sure about visual spatial skills, I thought I'd show you one of the test questions on a typical standardized test that relates to visual spatial skills. So one of the ways you can see this is mental rotation. So they'll take a three-dimensional object, show it in a variety of positions, and ask you a question about it, about which item on the right is the rotated image of the one on the far left. And boys tend to do better on those types of tests. Also, manipulating a mental image. So here it says a hole has been punched through the folded sheet of paper on the far left. Which item on the right actually accurately shows when the paper's been opened up. Visual spatial skills have also been linked to video games and to the skills required to be an architect. and those are both areas that tend to be have a dominant presence of males. Males are also more likely to actively participate in the classroom, so they're more likely to volunteer and help out their teachers, but they're also more likely to act out, to get in trouble, to be held back a grade, or to even drop out and not graduate. And here's some data to back that up. So when it comes to the high school dropout rate, it's not a huge difference, but it is statistically significant for my mathematician folks out there. All right, so not for notes, but did you happen to notice a pattern when I was talking about gender differences in terms of boys? Here's something that stood out to me. All of these were in our previous notes we just took. Boys more competitive and active, less interested in sharing their feelings with their friends, more aggressive and assertive, lower grades, more likely to misbehave, get held back, or drop out. This has been connected to an interesting area of research that I wanted to show you a video on. You will be taking a couple of notes on this video. This video is actually called The War on Boys, and it talks about how teachers may need to start to do more to engage boys in our classroom and to help them to be more academically and socially successful.
But increasingly, our schools have little patience for what only a couple of decades ago would have been described as boyishness. As psychologist Michael Thompson has aptly observed, girls' behavior is the gold standard in schools. Boys are treated like defective girls. Now, as a result, these defective girls are not faring well academically. Compared with girls, boys earn lower grades, they win fewer honors, they're far less likely to go to college. We need to start thinking about how we can make our grade school classrooms more boy-friendly, into readers. In all age groups, across all ethnic lines, boys score lower than girls on national reading tests. Good reading skills, need I say, are critical to academic and workplace success. A major study in the UK discovered, not surprisingly, that girls prefer fiction, magazines, and poetry, while boys prefer comics and nonfiction. Boys whose eyes glaze over if forced to read Little House on the Prairie may be riveted by the Guinness Book of Records.
Cool.
Boys will read if given materials that interest them, inspire the male imagination. Celebrated writing instructor Ralph Fletcher contends that too many teachers take what is called the confessional poet as the classroom ideal. Personal narratives full of emotions and self-disclosure. These are stories girls commonly write, and these are prized, whereas action stories describing, say, a skateboard competition or a monster devouring a city, these are not. If boys are constantly subject to disapproval for their interests and enthusiasms, they're likely to become disengaged and lag further behind. Zero out, zero tolerance. Boys are nearly 5 times as likely to be expelled from preschool as girls, and in grades K through 12, boys account for nearly 70% of suspensions. Now, this is often for minor acts of insubordination, and sometimes for entirely innocent behavior. Policy. Josh Welsh, age 7, was recently sent home from his Maryland school for nibbling off the corners of a strawberry Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. Bring back recess. Believe it or not, recess may soon be a thing of the past. According to research summarized by the Science Daily, since the 1970s, school children have lost close to 50% of their unstructured outdoor playtime, and much need to work off their energy. They need to be free to play games they enjoy, and keeping them cooped up and inside all day will not help them learn. Boys are in trouble. So are we all.
So again, I thought that was a really interesting video to share. It's something that you don't really hear much about, but it is very true. And again, this goes across all ethnicity lines, urban, rural schools. This is something that I think schools need to start to address, and this is also one of the reasons why I think we also need more male educators in our elementary schools. Okay, so this is going to be where we pause for our first video. On the next one, we're going to look at theories of gender differences, we're going to look at gender spectrum and some teaching tips. But until then,